In the ancient temples of Egypt, long before the desert winds buried their stone walls, a quiet ritual unfolded behind doors the public never saw. The priests who performed it did not speak of it openly, and scribes rarely recorded it. Yet its traces appear like faint shadows in surviving papyri and fragments of temple inscriptions suggesting that something deeply unsettling occurred in the hours before dawn. This ritual was neither a festival nor a public ceremony. It was a private act, carried out in chambers lit only by oil lamps, where statues of gods seemed to breathe in the flickering light. The Egyptians believed the divine lived within such statues, and to serve them was to maintain the balance of creation itself. But hidden within this daily cycle of offerings was a disturbing rite, one whispered about even in antiquity, a ritual that blurred the line between reverence and fear, obedience and possession. As we explore the temple world of ancient Egypt, we enter a space where silence held power, shadows carried meaning, and priests performed acts that were never meant for ordinary eyes. The temples of ancient Egypt were not built for the public. Their vast courtyards and towering pylons may have impressed the thousands who gathered outside during festivals, but the true life of a temple occurred deep within a series of inner chambers where only priests could step. These rooms were cool and dark even at midday, and the air carried a mixture of incense, oil, and ancient stone. Each morning before the first light touched the horizon, the priests walked through these halls barefoot, their linen robes whispering against the floor. They moved with a stillness that made the temple feel awake, as though the walls themselves listened. To the Egyptians, the temple was the literal house of a god, not a metaphor. The innermost sanctuary contained a statue in which the divine spirit was believed to reside. But this statue did not simply sit untouched. It required daily care, awakening, washing, feeding, clothing, and protection. The opening of the doors to this sanctuary was the most sacred moment of dawn. Yet for those who witnessed it, even priests trained from childhood, the moment carried a tension that even ancient texts acknowledged. The god was waking, the world was being restored, and the price of failure was unthinkable. The sanctuary doors were not like ordinary doors. They were heavy wooden panels, sometimes plated with bronze or gilded with gold leaf, engraved with protective spells. Opening them was an act of risk, for behind them, the god waited in silence. The text described the statue as living, awake, and alert, terms that scholars interpret both religiously and psychologically. For the priests, these words were not symbolic. They believed the divine presence was dangerous if approached without proper preparation. So before touching the doors, the priests recited purification formulas, washed themselves, shaved their bodies to remove impurities, and abstained from certain foods the night before. Even a stray thought, it was said, could offend the god. As the doors slowly creaked open, the first rays of the priest's lamp fell across the statue's face. The god's eyes, often inlaid with obsidian or rock crystal, caught the flame and reflected it back. To the priests, this was the moment when the god saw them. This encounter, though part of the daily cycle, was not gentle. The text described the priests as those who faced the divine flame, suggesting a heat or intensity that felt almost physical. Modern readers may imagine a carved statue, frozen and harmless. But to an ancient priest standing in the inner chamber, the god was present, aware, and capable of judgment. And it was in this moment, as the silence deepened and the air felt oddly heavy, that the disturbing ritual began. The priests believed that during the night, malevolent forces attempted to harm the god. These forces, chaos beings, serpents, shadows, were thought to creep into the sanctuary while the world slept. The statue, though divine, required protection, and thus the priests performed a ritual that involved inspecting the god's body for signs of attack. This was not a gentle inspection of carved stone. It was a ritual that required the priest to approach closely, press his forehead to the floor, and then rise to check the statue's limbs, face, and clothing for invisible wounds. The texts describe these wounds as damage inflicted by chaotic forces that the human eye could not perceive, but the priests acted as though they were real. They whispered spells meant to wipe away the bite of the serpent or remove the shadow that clings to the god's skin. Some rituals required the priest to touch the statue with specific oils that symbolically healed these invisible injuries. Others required the use of a small knife to cut away unseen entities that were believed to attach themselves to the divine form. To a modern observer, it may resemble a caretaker tending to a figure that cannot speak, but to the priest, this was different. Each act risked accidentally offending the god. Each gesture was performed under the weight of expectation. Restore the god, and the world remains stable. Fail, and the balance of creation tilts toward chaos. Ordinary Egyptians never witnessed this ritual. Even scribes recorded it sparingly, using phrases that seem cautious, as if describing something too delicate, too strange, or too dangerous to fully expose. What happened in those chambers stayed there, yet its impact spread far beyond the sanctuary walls. The priests believed that by cleansing the god of the dangers of the night, they protected the kingdom itself from famine, invasion, and cosmic disorder. Outside, the sun slowly rose over the Nile, but inside, the priests continued their work in silence. The sanctuary remained dim, the god's eyes reflecting the flame, watching. And with every movement, the priests reaffirmed their belief that the divine world was close enough to touch, close enough to fear, and always in need of protection. The Egyptians believed that sunrise was not simply the beginning of a new day. It was the moment when the cosmos restarted, when order overcame the darkness that had threatened to consume the world during the night. Inside the temple, the priests mirrored this cosmic rebirth through a ritual known simply as awakening the god. Though described with gentle language in some texts, its actual performance carried an unnerving intensity. The god was not an object. The god was a presence. To wake it was to disturb something powerful. As the priest approached the statue, the sanctuary remained dim, lit only by the flicker of an oil lamp. The rest of the temple still slept. Birds had not yet begun their chatter outside, and the city lay silent beneath the fading stars. In this stillness, the priest recited the first formula, a quiet invocation that asked permission to enter the god's awareness. The words were delivered in a whisper, as though a louder voice might provoke the divine spirit within the statue. Even the way the priest held the lamp was deliberate, slightly lowered, never raised directly toward the god's face, to avoid appearing confrontational. The ritual texts say, the god opens his eyes to the world once more. But anyone standing in the sanctuary during this moment would see only the glimmer of the flame reflected in polished stone. The ancient Egyptians interpreted this reflection not as a trick of light, but as a sign that the god's spirit had returned to the statue after its nightly journey through the underworld. To them, the god was waking, and with that awakening came a responsibility to restore the god's body to its perfect state. The priest began by offering incense, letting its smoke drift slowly through the air and settle around the statue like a veil. Incense was not simply a fragrance, but a purifying force, believed to ward off invisible enemies. The Egyptians thought that harmful spirits clung to the divine form during the night, and the smoke helped drive them away. Yet even as the priest moved the incense burner in gentle arcs, he remained careful not to let the smoke pass directly into his own face. Purification was meant for the god, not for the priest, and to absorb too much of it was considered dangerous. The next act was stranger. The priest dipped a reed brush into sacred water drawn from the Nile, water that had been blessed during a ritual hours earlier. He touched the brush to the statue's forehead, chest, and hands, murmuring words that have been translated as, "Remove the darkness from your limbs." These gestures were not symbolic. The Egyptians believed that during the night, the god's body accumulated a kind of spiritual residue, a heaviness or corruption left by the unseen forces that moved in the hours of silence. Washing the statue was cleansing the cosmos. Some rituals described the priest making circular motions over the statue's heart while reciting spells to loosen the breath of the god. To the Egyptians, a statue that had not been awakened properly was not fully alive, and a god that remained dormant risked leaving the world vulnerable. The priest's voice, kept low and steady, acted as the bridge between human and divine breath. It was said that a priest who stumbled over his lines invited disaster. Then came the offering of oil, one of the most intimate acts of the awakening. The priest dipped his fingers into a small alabaster jar, filled with fragrant unguent, and gently anointed the statue's face, arms, and legs. The oil was thick and glossy, catching the lamplight as the priest smoothed it across the divine skin. The purpose was twofold: to rejuvenate the god's body, and to symbolically repair the wounds inflicted in the night. But it also reflected something unsettling: the priest's direct physical contact with the god. Touching the divine was not taken lightly. It was, in many ways, a confrontation. Some surviving temple inscriptions hint that priests sometimes felt the presence push back. Of course, no physical movement is recorded, but the language speaks of the weight of the god, a sensation described as pressure in the air, as though the statue's spirit leaned toward the priest. Other priests wrote that the moment of anointing brought an overwhelming stillness, so profound that it felt as though sound itself had been removed from the world. When the oiling was complete, the priest stepped back and recited a formula affirming that the god was now awake, restored, and ready to receive offerings. This statement was made softly, but with a finality that marked a shift in the room. The sanctuary, moments earlier heavy with darkness, now felt changed. The god, in the ancient understanding, had re-entered the physical world. But with the awakening came another responsibility, one far more disturbing than anointing or washing. The god's body, though restored, still needed protection. Its awakening did not guarantee safety. Chaos was not defeated at dawn, it only retreated, and the priests believed that certain ritual acts were required to ensure it did not return. The next chapter explores the part of the ceremony even ancient scribes were hesitant to describe: the ritual in which priests confronted the forces they believed stalked the temple at night, and the symbolic violence they performed to keep the world whole. In ancient Egyptian belief, the sun's rising did not mean that danger had passed. It meant only that danger had shifted. The night was a realm of uncertainty, a time when chaos forces known collectively as Isfet moved freely through both the human world and the divine. Even as the god awakened inside the sanctuary, the priests believed that remnants of these forces still lingered like faint shadows clinging to the edges of the room. The ritual that followed was designed to confront these unseen enemies. Yet it was not a battle fought with swords or shields. It was a confrontation carried out in silence, precision, and symbolic violence. As the priest stood before the statue, the lingering incense smoke rose in thin spirals. The air felt thick, almost textured, as though it held more than fragrance. The Egyptians described evil not as a concept, but as a presence, one that could attach itself to objects, people, and even divine forms. The sanctuary, though sacred, was vulnerable. It was the god's responsibility to uphold order, but it was the priest's duty to protect the god during its vulnerable moments. And so the ritual began. The priest retrieved a small tray from the corner of the room. On it were miniature figurines, tiny clay or wax figures representing the god's enemies. Some were shaped like serpents, others like bound captives, with exaggerated features meant to embody chaos. These figures were crafted specifically for destruction. Their purpose was not to be admired, but to be broken. They symbolized every threat that could not be seen, every force that might have crept into the temple during the night's silence. Before the destruction began, the priest recited a spell that identified each figure by name. The Egyptians believed that naming an enemy stripped it of its power. Some names survive in texts: Apep, the great serpent of darkness; Nemeshur, a demon of confusion; Shesmu, a god who turned violent when the world was out of balance. Whether literal or symbolic, each name was spoken with the same low, steady tone, as though the priest feared speaking too loudly might summon the very forces he was trying to banish. Then came the cracking of clay. The priest's hands moved slowly, deliberately crushing the first figurine. The sound echoed softly in the stone room, a brittle snap that felt strangely loud in the sanctuary's stillness. The Egyptians described this action as breaking the backbone of the enemy. It was believed that the destruction of the figurine damaged the real enemy's ability to act in the divine realm. Each crack was a small victory, each crumble of clay a fragment of chaos neutralized. Some priests performed this ritual with their eyes lowered, avoiding direct confrontation with the statue. Others kept their gaze fixed on the god, as though seeking approval or protection. Every movement, every breath, was guided by fear and reverence in equal measure. For to mishandle the ritual was to leave the god vulnerable, and a vulnerable god meant a vulnerable kingdom. After the clay figures were broken, the priest moved on to the wax ones. Wax was more unsettling because it softened under heat. The figurines placed near the flame of the oil lamp slowly began to sag, melt, and lose form. The Egyptians believed this melting represented the weakening of chaotic forces as the god regained power with the sunrise. The priest watched as the wax dripped onto the tray, forming puddles that once resembled enemies. The slow deformation had a hypnotic quality, but beneath it lay a deeper meaning, order-consuming chaos, one drop at a time. Not all enemies were represented through figurines. Some were symbolized by lines drawn on papyrus abstract patterns, meant to trap or confuse harmful spirits. The priest used a ritual knife made of flint or copper to slice through the symbols, effectively cutting down these invisible foes. The papyrus strips were then burned, the flames crackling quietly in a small ceremonial bowl. Smoke curled into the air, mingling with the incense, creating a haze that blurred the outlines of the room. Throughout this destruction, the priest murmured spells. These were not shouts of triumph, but whispers, almost like lullabies spoken to the god. The language carried a rhythm, a soft cadence that made the ritual feel calm despite its violent symbolism. Each word affirmed the same truth. The god was being defended, and the world was being restored. When the last figurine was broken, and the final papyrus strip reduced to ash, the priest collected the remains clay dust, wax residue, burned fragments, and placed them into a small container. These remains were not discarded casually. They were taken to a designated place, sometimes buried, sometimes thrown into the Nile, sometimes burned again to ensure complete dissolution. The ritual's effectiveness depended on ensuring no trace of chaos survived. Only after the enemies had been symbolically defeated could the sanctuary breathe. The priest felt the shift, a subtle lightness in the air. It was not relief exactly, but a momentary stillness, the same stillness that precedes dawn. With the enemies subdued, the next act of the ritual could proceed, offering nourishment to the god, a practice meant to strengthen the divine form and prepare it to face another day. What followed was not violent, but deeply intimate, and it revealed another unsettling truth about the relationship between priests and the gods they served. A truth explored in the next chapter, when the god's first meal of the day was presented with ritual care and eerie caution. The Egyptians believed their gods were alive, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but in a direct, active sense. A statue housed a divine presence, a force with awareness, memory, and appetite. Yet the god could not eat the way humans did, and so the priests performed the ritual of nourishment. On the surface, it appeared gentle. Trays of food, cups of beer, bowls of pure water placed carefully before the divine statue. But within the sanctuary, the ritual carried an unnerving tone. The priest understood that feeding the god was not a kind gesture. It was an obligation, one that demanded complete precision. If done incorrectly, the god's strength could falter, and the daily order of the cosmos could weaken. As the priest approached with the first offering, the chamber was still dim. The incense smoke gathered near the ceiling like a drifting veil, turning the air hazy. The god's statue, polished stone, glowing faintly with the earlier anointing, stood in complete silence. To an outsider, the scene might have seemed peaceful, but to the priest, standing in the presence of something believed to be eternally awake, the silence felt heavier. The god watched without moving. The first item placed before the statue was water, contained in a simple ceramic vessel. Water from the Nile was considered the purest of offerings, a symbol of life and rebirth. The priest poured a small amount into a basin, whispering a formula that invited the god to drink the essence of renewal. Of course, the water level never changed, but the Egyptians believed the god consumed the spiritual essence, leaving behind a residue that humans could later use. This duality, untouched yet consumed, was one of the many mysteries that made the ritual both fascinating and unsettling. Next came bread, not ordinary bread baked by commoners, but finely prepared loaves made in sacred kitchens within the temple complex. These loaves were shaped with extreme care, sometimes marked with hieroglyphs or symbols representing life, strength, or protection. The priest placed several loaves onto a low offering table and recited another invocation. This time, the words carried a tone of insistence, as though urging the god to accept the nourishment. There are texts describing priests feeling a sudden draft when they placed the bread, as if the air shifted sharply for just a moment, whether caused by the movement of their own robes or an odd pressure change inside the sanctuary. The effect was memorable enough to be recorded. Some priests interpreted the draft as a sign that the god had drawn near to the food, consuming the life force of the offering. The Egyptians did not need physical movement to believe in divine action. A slight change in the room was enough. After the bread came meat, small cuts from cattle, birds, or fish, depending on the temple's traditions. These were placed carefully before the statue, never touching the floor. The offering of meat was not always included in the daily ritual, but when it was, the tone shifted. Meat symbolized strength and dominance, and its presence invited the god to restore power taken by the chaotic forces of the night. Some priests admitted unease during this part of the ceremony, not because of the food itself, but because the offering carried the energy of something sacrificed. It reminded them that the god's protection came at a cost. The final nourishment was beer. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and capable of sustaining life by itself. The priest poured it into a ceremonial cup and held it before the statue. This step was always done with care. Beer represented joy, celebration, and divine pleasure, but it also represented vulnerability. Myths describe gods who became too intoxicated, losing control, blurring the line between benevolence and destruction. Offering beer meant trusting that the god would drink only the essence, not the chaos hidden in excess. Once all offerings were placed, the priest stepped back and recited the presentation formula. It was both an invitation and a declaration, acknowledging the god's power and asking for continued protection over the kingdom. The silence that followed was profound. The priest waited, listening for any subtle shift that might signal acceptance. A soft flicker of the lamp, a momentary tremble of the flame, these quiet movements felt significant. Whether spiritual or simply the result of air currents, the priests interpreted them as communication. After the god had consumed the essence of the offerings, the priest performed the withdrawal. He did not turn his back on the statue. Doing so was taboo. Instead, he moved backward, gathering the offerings one by one. The food, now considered spiritually charged, would later be distributed among the temple staff or used for other rituals. To the Egyptians, eating food touched by the god was not dangerous but transformative. The divine essence could strengthen the body, sharpen the senses, or bless one's path. But the act of removing the offerings revealed something unsettling. The god remained silent through it all. Every day, the priests nourished a being who never spoke, never moved, never acknowledged the care, yet they believed that failing to do so would invite disaster. This paradox was the heart of temple life, a constant balance between devotion and fear. And it raised a deeper question. If feeding the god maintained cosmic order, what happened when the god's body itself needed to be renewed? The next chapter explores the ritual of dressing the divine statue, a ceremony more intimate than feeding, and far stranger in its implications. In the stillness of the sanctuary, after the god had been nourished and the remnants of chaos driven away, the priest prepared for one of the most intimate acts of the entire ritual cycle, dressing the divine body. To the Egyptians, the god was not a distant force. The statue before them was the living vessel of that deity, and clothing it was an act of profound care and profound risk. The priest approached this task with a mixture of devotion, hesitation, and a quiet fear that ancient texts did not hide. The god was awake now. The god was watching. Before touching the garments, the priest purified his hands. In a small basin near the sanctuary wall, he dipped his fingers into water infused with natron, a natural salt used for purification. This was not symbolic cleansing, it was preparation for direct contact with the divine. The Egyptians believed impurity was not dirt, but a force, one that could cling to a person and offend a god if carried into sacred action. The ritual emphasized clarity of mind, stillness of breath, and a precision that bordered on ritual choreography. The garments laid out for the god were stored in a wooden chest decorated with protective spells. Inside were fine linen cloths, each woven by women dedicated to temple service. Some linens were simple, while others were embroidered with small symbols, geometric patterns, or faint traces of gold thread. The priest lifted the first garment slowly, allowing it to unfold in the dim light. Linen was considered a pure material, the clothing of the gods, smooth, white, and untouched by dyes that were seen as worldly and imperfect. The act of dressing the statue began with the god's lower body. The priest approached with deliberate steps and gently placed the linen kilt around the statue's waist. The fabric never touched the floor. Such a mistake would render it useless. As he secured the garment, the priest whispered the formula that translated roughly to, "May your limbs be renewed." The Egyptians believed gods aged in their statues the way the sun aged across the sky, and clothing was a way to refresh the divine form. What made this ritual strangely intimate and unsettling was the silence. The priest worked in near-complete quiet, interrupted only by the soft rustle of linen. The god's face, carved from stone but believed to be aware, watched with eyes that reflected the lamp's flame. Priests described this sensation not as imagination, but as experience. The god's presence pressed upon the room, heavy and constant. Next came the chest sash and broad collar. These regalia were symbols of authority, designed to reaffirm the god's role as ruler of the cosmic order. The broad collar, often made of beads or finely woven threads, glimmered faintly in the lamplight. It was placed carefully around the statue's neck, with both hands raised, palms open, a gesture meant to show that the priest brought nothing harmful. There were rules, strict ones, about the order of dressing. The god had to be clothed the same way every day, piece by piece, gesture by gesture. Changing the sequence risked interrupting the cosmic balance that the ritual maintained. Even the way the priest's feet were placed mattered. Temple scrolls describe precise stances and angles, as though the priest's body became part of the ritual architecture. After the clothing was secured, the priest applied scented oil to the god's garments, a gesture that combined nourishment and protection. The scents varied by temple. Some used lotus oil, symbolizing rebirth. Others used myrrh or cedar, which had associations with eternity. The fragrance filled the sanctuary, thick and sweet, mingling with the incense from earlier. The air grew heavy, saturated with sacred smells, creating an atmosphere that felt otherworldly, as though the physical world had been temporarily replaced by something slower, quieter, and deeper. The priest then adorned the statue with accessories. A headdress, if the god wore one, bracelets, anklets, or a ceremonial staff. These items were not decorative. Each carried a symbolic function. A headdress signaled the god's dominion over the sky. A staff represented the god's power to protect. The jewelry often carried protective spells, meant to shield the god from invisible harm. Handling these objects required focus. A dropped bracelet could be seen as an offense. A misplaced headdress might be interpreted as disrespect. Mistakes were rarely punished publicly, but priests believed the consequences would reveal themselves in other ways: illness, misfortune, or a sudden imbalance in the daily rituals. When the dressing was complete, the priest stepped back, bowing slightly. He did not turn his back on the statue. Doing so would be seen as turning away from the divine presence. Instead, he moved sideways toward the sanctuary door, the oil lamp casting shadows that stretched across the walls. The god, now fully clothed and adorned, was considered renewed, made whole again, after the vulnerabilities of the night. But the ritual was not finished. Dressing the god was only one part of maintaining cosmic order. The god's renewed body required protection, and that protection came not from clothing, but from a darker practice, sealing the sanctuary against forces that might attempt to enter during the day. In the next chapter, the priest confronts something even more unsettling than chaos figures or broken wax, the ritual of closing the sanctuary doors to trap the divine presence within, ensuring the god remains safely contained until the next dawn. With the god now fed, awakened, and dressed, the priest entered one of the most paradoxical phases of temple life, closing the sanctuary and sealing the divine presence inside. If the morning ritual was meant to awaken creation, the sealing ritual was meant to protect it. To outsiders, closing doors might seem simple. But in ancient Egypt, shutting the sanctuary doors was not an act of ending it, was an act of containing something powerful enough to shape the world. The Egyptians believed that the divine presence inside the statue radiated energy. That energy maintained order. It kept the Nile steady, the sky secure, and the land fertile. But it also attracted forces seeking to disrupt that stability. Chaos, in Egyptian thought, was not defeated, it was always waiting, always moving, always searching for a crack through which to enter. The sanctuary doors were the first line of defense. The priest began by lowering the light. The oil lamp was dimmed until only a soft glow remained, enough to see the outline of the god's face, but not enough to cast clear shadows. Darkness was not feared in the sanctuary. It was controlled. Light and shadow acted as tools. A brighter flame could provoke the divine presence, while a dimmer one softened the atmosphere, helping the priest withdraw without disrupting the god's rest. Before touching the doors, the priest recited a brief incantation, a formula repeated so often it became part of his breathing. It acknowledged the god's renewed state and promised vigilance throughout the day. The words acted as a polite farewell and a subtle reassurance, a reminder that although the priest was leaving, he had not abandoned his duty. The sanctuary doors were heavy. Their wooden surfaces were carved with protective hieroglyphs, each symbol chosen with intention. Some represented deities who guarded thresholds. Others depicted eyes that watched for intruders. The carvings served as spiritual locks, complementing the physical ones. As the priest placed his hands upon the doors, he paused. Temple texts describe this moment as the listening. The priest waited for the room to still completely, for the god in the priest's mind to settle. In that silence, the air thickened. The faint scent of incense clung to the priest's clothes. Stone walls absorbed the last of the whispers. Nothing moved. When the moment felt right, when the presence in the room no longer pressed outward, the priest pulled the doors gently toward each other. The sound was soft but final. Wood sliding against stone, the slow closing of a world humans were not meant to remain in for long. As the gap narrowed, the last sliver of light shrank across the statue's face. The flame reflected in the god's eyes for a moment, then vanished into darkness. But the doors did not simply close, they were sealed. A small bar, often made of cedar or acacia wood, was slid into place. It wasn't for security in a physical sense. No thief would dare approach the sanctuary. Instead, it symbolized the priest's commitment to maintaining the boundary between worlds. In Egyptian cosmology, doors were not barriers but portals. Sealing the sanctuary meant ensuring the god remained contained within its rightful domain, protected from chaos and preserved for the next day's awakening. After sealing the doors, the priest touched the carvings lightly with the tips of his fingers. This was not part of every temple's tradition, but many priests wrote of doing it instinctively. The gesture acknowledged the guardians etched into the wood: falcons, serpents, eyes, and crowns, calling upon them to watch the god while the temple operated outside the sanctuary. Next came an action often overlooked in translations. The priest traced a circle on the ground before the closed doors. Circles symbolized wholeness and protection, forming an invisible barrier that malevolent forces could not cross. This gesture, simple and small, represented one of the most powerful protective spells of the ritual cycle. Even after the priest left the room, the circle remained, unseen but active, a silent defense woven into the temple floor. The priest then stepped back and bowed, still never turning his back on the doors. This bow was not a farewell but a recognition. The god was both accessible and untouchable, present yet isolated. The priest respected the boundary he had just reinforced. As he exited the sanctuary chamber, He walked in reverse steps until he crossed the threshold. Only then could he turn and continue through the inner halls. The temple behind him seemed to breathe differently once he left the sanctuary. The corridors, lit by distant lamps, felt cooler now that the divine presence had been contained. The weight of the sacred room no longer pressed on his shoulders, but the responsibility lingered. Outside, the sun had risen. The world moved again, priests beginning their tasks, servants sweeping floors, offerings being prepared. But the sanctuary remained dark, sealed, silent. The god rested behind carved doors, renewed yet unreachable, alive yet unseen. This sealing ritual raised a question that troubled even the ancient Egyptians. If the god required such protection inside its own house, what did that say about the forces outside? The next chapter explores the hidden dangers the Egyptians believed lurked beyond the temple walls, and why priests never performed their rituals without preparing their own bodies as shields against unseen threats. Even after sealing the sanctuary, the priest's work was far from complete. The Egyptians believed that a priest who had just interacted with a divine presence was not the same as he had been moments before. The encounter altered him, his breath, his thoughts, even the invisible layers of his body. To step back into the ordinary world, he had to undergo purification. Not because he was defiled, but because he now carried traces of something that did not belong to the realm of humans. This transition between the divine and the mortal was considered dangerous. If left unaddressed, the priests believed the residue of sacred power, raw, unbalanced, and intense, could cause illness, distort judgment, or attract hostile forces. And so the purification ritual began in a small chamber near the sanctuary, a place few ever saw, described vaguely in temple records as the Room of Returning. The chamber was simple in design. Its walls were bare limestone, smooth and pale, absorbing the faint glow of the oil lamp placed on a low stand. The air was cooler here, not heavy like the sanctuary, but crisp, as though it held its own quiet purpose. A basin of water waited in the center. This water, drawn before dawn, carried symbolic purity. It had not yet been touched by the heat of the day, nor by the bustle of temple life. The priest leaned over the basin, allowing the surface to reflect his face. This reflection was part of the ritual. The Egyptians believed the face was where divine energy lingered after an encounter with a god. Seeing one's reflection confirmed that the self had returned, that the priest was still anchored to the human world, and had not been pulled too close to the divine realm. He dipped his hands into the water. The coolness spread quickly across his skin. With slow, controlled movements, he splashed water onto his face and over his head, murmuring a short formula asking the gods of purification to withdraw what is not mine. These words were meant to strip away the invisible residue of the ritual, the lingering echo of the god's presence. The water, now symbolically heavy with what it absorbed, was never reused. Temple servants later discarded it in a place designated for spiritual waste. Next came natron, a white, crumbly mineral used in everything from mummification to temple cleansing. The priest rubbed a small amount across his arms, chest, and shoulders. Natron was believed to dry out impurities, to absorb and neutralize forces that clung to the body. This part of the ritual was performed in complete silence. The air, the stone, the water, everything in the room seemed to lean inward, acknowledging the purpose. A strange step followed. The priest inhaled deeply through his nose, lifted his head, and exhaled slowly through a narrow opening formed by his lips. This controlled breath, described in translations as the breath of separation, symbolized releasing the final threads of divine contact. The Egyptians believed breath carried power. To inhale too soon, before purification, risked drawing divine energy inward in a harmful way. To exhale too sharply risked expelling something vital. The priest had to breathe with intention, reclaiming his humanity with every controlled movement. The purification did not end with water and natron. The priest lifted a small wand carved in the shape of a feather, the feather of Ma'at, symbol of truth and cosmic balance. He traced it through the air from head to heart, then to each shoulder. The gesture was not meant to touch the skin, but to realign the unseen lines of force, believed to run through the body. Once complete, the feather was placed back on the small stand beside the lamp. Even this minor act carried ritual weight. Lastly, the priest touched the ground with the tips of his fingers. This simple gesture reconnected him to the physical world. After standing before a god and participating in rituals that existed outside the normal flow of time, grounding was essential. The temple floor, carved stone resting upon the earth, symbolized stability. It reminded the priest that although he served the divine, he belonged to the human realm. The purification ritual ended with the priest straightening his posture and walking slowly from the room. No one spoke to him yet. Temple attendants knew he needed silence until he crossed the threshold into the larger hall. Only then, after his body had been symbolically rebuilt, was he considered safe to rejoin the living world. What made this process unsettling was not its complexity, but what it implied. The divine contact was dangerous, even for those trained to withstand it. But purification prepared the priest for more than safety. It prepared him to preserve the temple itself. For the Egyptians believed that once the god was sealed inside, the temple became a battleground. Forces of chaos lingered just outside the perimeters, waiting for weakness. In the next chapter, we enter the outer courts of the temple, where priests performed rituals not to honor the god, but to defend the walls from things the human eye could not see. While the sanctuary was the heart of the temple, the outer courts were its skin exposed, vulnerable, and constantly threatened by forces the Egyptians believed moved through the world like drifting shadows. To them, chaos was not symbolic. It was a presence, always pressing inward, always seeking a crack in the world's order. And so, after purifying himself, the priest stepped into the open courtyard and prepared for a ritual few modern readers imagine: the defense of the temple walls. The sun had now risen fully, casting long beams of gold across the columns. Dust floated gently in the light, swirling like faint spirits of the morning. Temple workers swept the floors, but they never swept certain places where protective rituals were performed daily. These untouched areas were marked not by boundaries, but by an invisible awareness, something only the priests recognized. They believed these spaces were threshold points, vulnerable openings where chaos might slip inside. The priest approached the first threshold, a carved gateway flanked by towering pillars. Although this gateway connected the outer courtyard to the inner halls, it was also considered a spiritual crossroads. According to ancient texts, harmful forces lurked at the edges of such spaces, waiting for the moment when divine protection was weakest. And so, each morning, the priest performed a ritual of warding. He began by sprinkling water mixed with natron across the ground. The droplets caught the sunlight, forming a glistening path that symbolized purification. But this was not merely cleansing, it was a symbolic barrier. Water in Egyptian thought represented renewal, but natron represented neutralization. Together, they created a boundary between the sacred and the uninvited. With the ground purified, the priest moved to the pillars. He ran his fingers lightly along their carved surfaces, tracing symbols of falcons, ankhs, and protective eyes. These gentle motions were part of the ritual. They activated the spells carved into the stone. In Egyptian belief, hieroglyphs were not decoration. They were words in physical form, alive, potent, ready to act. If left unacknowledged, their power weakened. The priest's touch awakened them again. Then came the unsettling part of the ritual. The priest retrieved a small bag of sand, stained with red ochre. This sand represented the desert, the harsh, barren realm where chaos reigned and malevolent spirits thrived. Egyptians believed such spirits feared red, the color of blood and fire, symbols that invoked divine strength. The priest took a pinch of the sand, raised his hand toward the gateway, and let the grains fall slowly to the ground. Each falling grain represented a destroyed enemy. Each small pile symbolized a defeated threat. It was a quiet act, almost gentle, but deeply symbolic. Even the smallest gesture could affirm the boundary between order and disorder. The sand ritual was performed at all major thresholds, gateways, doorways, passage entrances, anywhere that connected one realm of the temple to another. After the sand was placed, the priest took out a short ritual wand, often carved from ivory or wood. Some were shaped like serpents, others like hands or feathers. The priest used the wand to draw invisible lines in the air, forming protective barriers that only the trained eye could understand. These lines were said to bind chaotic forces, preventing them from crossing into the temple's core. From the outside, it looked like the priest was stirring the empty air, but to him, he was weaving layered walls of unseen protection. The final step was reciting the utterance of watching. This was not a prayer to the God inside the sanctuary. It was a command to the forces outside. Spoken in a low, steady voice, the utterance warned hostile spirits that the temple was guarded, that vigilance stood at every threshold, and that they would find no opening, not at the walls, not at the gates, not at the cracks between stones. Some priests described a peculiar feeling during this part of the ritual, a sudden chill in the air, a shift in the breeze, or a sense that the courtyard had grown strangely quiet. Whether psychological or spiritual, the sensation reinforced their belief that something unseen had retreated. Once the thresholds were secured, the priest moved to the outermost wall. This outer boundary separated the world of humans from the world of the divine. Every morning, a ritual of sealing the four corners took place. The priest walked the perimeter, stopping at each corner to touch the stone and whisper words meant to anchor the temple's protection at its edges. Corners were dangerous in Egyptian cosmology. They were liminal spaces, vulnerable to disruption. Strengthening them meant strengthening the entire sacred world within. When the ritual was complete, the priest stepped back and observed the temple in silence. To ordinary eyes, nothing had changed. The walls were the same. The gateways were the same. The air held the same warmth of dawn. But to the priest, the temple had transformed. Its invisible defenses were active now, guarding the God within, guarding the humans outside. Yet even with these protections, the priests believed the world beyond the walls remained unpredictable. Chaos did not always come as an enemy. It sometimes came as memory, shadow, or fear. And the next ritual confronted one of the most mysterious dangers of all, the echoes left behind by those who once entered the temple but no longer lived. To the Egyptians, a temple was more than stone and ritual. It was a vessel holding years, centuries of footsteps, voices, breath, and intention. Every priest who had served within its walls left something behind. Not a soul exactly, and not a ghost in the modern sense, but an echo, a residue, a presence formed from repeated ritual, devotion, and fear. These echoes were not malevolent, but they were powerful. And if left unmanaged, the Egyptians believed they could interfere with the living priest's duties, confusing the spiritual boundaries that the morning rituals worked so hard to maintain. Thus, after securing the outer walls, the priest performed a ritual rarely described in full, the clearing of echoes. The ritual took place in a narrow passage between the outer courtyard and the inner halls, a liminal space known in old temple records as the corridor of remembering. The walls here were undecorated, smooth, and pale. The chamber had a unique quality. Sound behaved strangely in it. Even a whisper seemed to linger for a moment longer than expected, as if reluctant to fade. The Egyptians considered such lingering sound a sign that the space was full of memory. This was not metaphor. They believed the corridor held impressions of past rituals, broken fragments of voices, repeated formulas, the breath of priests long buried in desert tombs. These impressions could distract or disorient the living, if not regularly cleared. The priest entered the corridor alone. The air felt heavier here. Even the sunlight that reached the entrance seemed muted, unable to fully penetrate the narrow space. He held a small bronze mirror in his left hand and a reed rattle in his right. Together, these two objects symbolized clarity and disruption. The mirror's reflective surface was polished until it captured the faintest glimmer of light. Its purpose was symbolic, to draw wandering echoes toward it. The Egyptians believed that reflections acted like traps for residual forces. A mirror could attract what the priest could not see and hold it long enough to be neutralized. The reed rattle served a different function. Its sound was sharp, dry and strangely abrupt, nothing like the softer tones of temple music. When shaken, it created a jarring contrast to the calm air. As though cutting through a veil, the Egyptians used such rattles to disrupt stagnant energy, to shake loose the invisible layers of sound still clinging to the walls. The priest began by facing the corridor's far end, the darkest point of the passage. He lifted the mirror slightly, angling it so it caught whatever faint light remained. Then he shook the rattle once. The sound echoed too long, too strangely. Even the priest, accustomed to this phenomenon, felt a brief tension in his chest. It was not fear, but recognition. The corridor was full. He moved slowly down the passage, shaking the rattle at intervals. Each burst of sound seemed to collide with the walls, bounce, slide, and linger. The mirror trembled slightly in his hand, not from movement, but from the subtle vibration of the air around him. This was the unnerving part. Priests believed that echoes resisted being cleared. Not intentionally, but as though the residue of past rituals clung instinctively to the stones where they had been created. When he reached the center of the corridor, he paused. This point was always the heaviest, the thickest. Ancient texts describe it as the place where breath stays. The priest crouched slightly, holding the mirror at his chest level. Then, with slow, steady movements, he traced a circle in the air using the edge of the mirror. This motion symbolized containment. The circle gathered the lingering echoes and held them together, preventing them from dispersing back into the passage. Once the circle was complete, the priest shook the rattle 3 times each, louder than the last. This sudden burst of sound was meant to drive the collected echoes inward, pushing them into the mirror's reflective surface. The ritual texts are vague about what exactly the priest believed happened at this moment, but all agree on one point. The corridor felt lighter afterward, as though a weight had been lifted. With the echoes captured, the priest walked slowly back toward the entrance. He did not look at the mirror directly. Doing so, the Egyptians believed, risked seeing something not meant for the living eye, a flicker of past ritual, a fragment of another priest's voice, or the lingering imprint of ancient fear. At the threshold, he placed the mirror into a small stone niche carved into the wall. There it remained until sunset, absorbing the trapped echoes. Only then would another priest perform the final act of neutralization, cleansing the mirror in lotus water and returning it to its chest for the next day's cycle. The corridor now felt still, clean, neutral. The priest could pass freely through it without hearing stray whispers or feeling the pull of memories that were not his own. But clearing the echoes was only one step in preparing the temple for the day ahead. The Egyptians believed that not only memories, but also time itself behaved differently inside sacred walls. It stretched, folded, and lingered where rituals repeated day after day, year after year. And so the next ritual confronted something even stranger: the management of sacred time, a practice designed to keep the past, present, and future from colliding inside the temple. To modern eyes, a temple might appear fixed in the moment, unchanging stone, steady rituals, and a daily cycle unfolding with predictable rhythm. Yet the Egyptians believed that inside sacred walls, time behaved in ways that did not always follow earthly rules. The repetition of rituals, the echo of words spoken day after day, and the presence of the divine created a kind of temporal layering. Past actions, present duties, and future possibilities existed close enough to touch, pressing into one another until their boundaries grew thin. A priest entering the temple did not simply step into a new day. He stepped into a space where yesterday, today, and tomorrow drifted like overlapping currents. If left unattended, these currents could blend in unsettling ways, causing confusion in the rituals or weakening the sacred order the temple was built to protect. For this reason, one of the priest's most unusual tasks was the ritual stabilizing of time itself. The ritual began in a chamber placed deep within the temple, known as the Room of First Light. Although sunlight rarely reached its walls, the space was designed to evoke dawn. Soft yellows and pale blues had once been painted along the plaster, imitating the sky's earliest glow. Even in their faded state, the colors reminded the priest that the day had technically begun, But the temple had not yet aligned itself with that beginning. Here, standing alone in the quiet, the priest prepared to re-establish the day so that time inside the temple would not drift backward into the rituals of yesterday, or fold forward into the unformed hours of the coming night. The first instrument he worked with was a ceremonial water clock. Its shape was simple, a rounded bowl carved from alabaster or limestone, with a tiny hole that allowed water to drip out in a steady rhythm. Yet its purpose went beyond measuring hours. The Egyptians believed the movement of water embodied the flow of time, continuous, irreversible, and unable to be reclaimed once it escaped through the opening. The priest filled the vessel with purified water, watching the surface settle into stillness before the first drop fell. As the water began its slow descent, he whispered an invocation acknowledging the beginning of the day's timeline. To him, this was not a symbolic gesture but a necessary act. Without this acknowledgement, time within the temple risked lingering in the previous day or stretching prematurely into the next. As the water dripped, he took a clay tablet and, using a reed stylus, drew a series of lines across its surface. These were not words. They were anchor points, each marking moments within the coming day that required stability: dawn, midday, sunset, and the deep hours of night when rituals began again. These lines acted like stakes placed into soft ground, holding the flow of time firmly in place so it could not slip or distort under the pressure of accumulated ritual. The next act was both symbolic and unsettling. The Egyptians believed that without proper anchoring, fragments of the previous day lingered in sacred spaces like faint shadows. These were not spirits, but impressions of the rituals performed hours earlier, echoes of movement, memory, and spoken formula. If ignored, they could interfere with the clarity required for the present day's work. To sever these remnants, the priest used a flint blade rather than metal. Flint was older, closer to the earth's earliest memory, and therefore more effective at cutting what was intangible. He raised the blade slowly and sliced downward through the air. To any observer, it would appear meaningless, but to the priest it signified the deliberate separation of yesterday from today, ensuring the temple did not blend the two into a confusing repetition. Once the past was symbolically cut away, the priest turned his focus back to the present. He placed his hand above the water clock, feeling the faint movement of air created by the dripping water. The rhythm of the drops combined with the slow rise and fall of his breath, allowing him to center himself within the unfolding day. The Egyptians believed that when the priest's breath aligned with the water's rhythm, the present moment settled into place. It was a quiet, almost meditative practice, meant to attune the temple's internal time to the world outside its walls. But the future also demanded attention. To the Egyptians, tomorrow was not a distant concept, but a presence that hovered at the edges of sacred places, an accumulation of possibilities, potential disturbances, and unformed events. If left uncontained, these possibilities might rush forward and influence the present day's rituals with anxiety, uncertainty, or imbalance. To prevent this, the priest took a cord woven from papyrus fibers and tied 3 knots. These knots represented boundaries: one for what must remain unknown until its proper time, another for what must not arrive before it is due, and a third for what must wait quietly at the threshold of the future. The cord was placed beside the water clock and would remain tied until sunset, when the day's completion allowed it to be safely undone. When the ritual was complete, the chamber felt subtly altered. The air seemed clearer, the silence deeper, and the sense of drift, the feeling that past, present, and future pressed too closely together, had eased. Time within the temple now matched the world beyond its walls. The priest allowed himself a slow exhale, not of relief, but of recognition. The day had been anchored, the temple was ready, yet stabilizing time did not protect the priest from the most unpredictable influence in the sacred world: his own mind. Thoughts, fears, memories, and stray emotions could disrupt a ritual as effectively as any hostile force. And so, the next ritual addressed something far more intimate than cosmic time or divine presence: the cleansing of thought, the act of quieting the inner world before continuing the sacred duties of the day. After stabilizing the flow of time within the temple, the priest turned inward. The Egyptians believed that the greatest threat to the purity of ritual did not always come from chaotic forces outside the walls or from lingering echoes in the corridors. Often, the most unpredictable and disruptive force rested within the human mind itself. Thoughts drifted without permission, worries pulled attention away from sacred duties, and memories rose unexpectedly from within. These internal movements were considered dangerous when performing rituals intended to maintain cosmic order, because a priest's thoughts held influence over the energy he carried. The temple required steady intention, and the mind had to be shaped into stillness before the day's next tasks could begin. The ritual took place in a small chamber located near the deeper halls. The room contained little more than a platform for sitting, and a narrow niche in the wall that held a small bowl of water and a single clay tablet. The simplicity of the setting mattered, because any object in the room was believed capable of shaping or redirecting thoughts. By keeping the space bare, the priest allowed his mind to settle without distraction. He entered slowly, letting the sounds of the outer court fade behind him. No chanting accompanied this ritual. The Egyptians understood that silence could be a tool just as powerful as spoken words. The priest sat on the platform with his hands resting lightly on his knees and lowered his gaze. A lowered gaze signified humility, but it also prevented the mind from wandering outward. Looking directly at the walls or floor could invite thoughts to attach themselves to the shapes or textures surrounding him. A softened gaze kept the mind steady. The priest began by breathing in a controlled rhythm. Breathing exercises were rarely written about in temple texts, but fragments survive that describe the body as a container for wind and quiet fire. When breath moved too quickly, the inner fire flared upward, disturbing clarity. When breath moved too slowly, the body grew heavy and unresponsive. Finding balance was essential. The priest inhaled through the nose, held the breath for a moment, and released it in a steady stream. This sequence continued until his shoulders relaxed, and his chest no longer felt tight from the pressures of the morning rituals. Once the breath settled, the priest placed one hand over his forehead. This gesture symbolized gathering the scattered thoughts of the mind. The Egyptians believed that thoughts were not confined to the brain but drifted throughout the body in fine currents of unseen energy. Touching the forehead called these currents back to their origin, allowing the mind to regain focus. The priest then moved his hand to his chest, a gesture intended to connect thought with intention. A clear mind held little value if the heart did not support it. Near the platform rested the bowl of water. The priest reached for it and brought it close enough to reflect his face. This reflection did not carry the same purpose as the mirror used in the clearing of echoes. In this ritual, the reflection served as an anchor. By looking into the surface of the water, the priest observed the stillness or agitation of his own thoughts. If ripples in the water appeared from his breath or movement, he waited for the surface to calm before continuing. A still reflection signified readiness. The clay tablet in the niche represented the final stage of mental purification. The priest traced a simple horizontal line across its surface. This line had no phonetic meaning. It represented a quiet boundary, a separation between the mind he carried into the room and the mind he intended to bring back into the temple. The line was not decorative, nor was it intended to last. At sunset, it would be smoothed away, demonstrating that clarity was never permanent, but required daily attention. With the line drawn, the priest placed both hands over his heart and closed his eyes. This moment was not meditation in the modern sense, but a symbolic offering of thought itself. The Egyptians believed the heart held a record of one's intentions. By covering it with his hands, the priest shielded his intentions from intruding thoughts and affirmed that the mind was ready for sacred work. He remained in this posture for as long as necessary, feeling the silence become deeper and more complete. When he finally opened his eyes, he moved slowly to stand, making sure not to disturb the atmosphere he had cultivated. Leaving the chamber required care. The priest stepped toward the doorway without haste, allowing the stillness of the ritual to remain intact. If he moved too quickly, the Egyptians believed the mind might scatter again, losing the calm it had achieved. By crossing the threshold gently, he carried the quiet of the room into the broader temple, strengthening his ability to perform the remainder of the day's rituals with clarity and steadiness. The priest now returned to the structured world of the temple with a mind free of wandering thought. a heart aligned with intention, and a breath synchronized with the rhythm of the day. Yet even with mental clarity restored, the temple demanded further preparation. The Egyptians believed that certain spaces within the temple could accumulate unseen residue, not of thought or memory, but of energy produced by the rituals themselves. These accumulations were considered capable of influencing the atmosphere in subtle ways, adding weight or tension to rooms that should remain neutral. The next ritual addressed this invisible residue and ensured that every chamber maintained the purity necessary for its function within the sacred world of the temple. After quieting the mind, the priest moved on to a task that most temple visitors, even those permitted into the outer halls, never suspected existed. The Egyptians believed that rituals, through repeated action and concentrated intention, left behind an imprint. This imprint was neither thought nor memory, but a subtle residue created by the movement of sacred energy within enclosed spaces. Rooms where rituals were performed regularly accumulated more of this residue over time, especially in corners, along the upper edges of walls, or in spaces where air flowed unevenly. If these accumulations were left unattended, they could alter the atmosphere of the temple, producing heaviness in rooms meant to feel light, or restlessness in rooms meant to be still. The priest understood that this invisible buildup needed to be cleared before the day progressed. The ritual took place at different points throughout the temple, depending on which rooms had been used most heavily the day before. The priest first visited the offering hall, a space that absorbed strong ritual energy from the food, incense, and invocations used earlier in the morning. Although the hall appeared clean, the Egyptians believed appearances had little relation to what lingered in the unseen layers of its air and stone. The priest stepped into the center of the room and paused long enough to sense the atmosphere. Temple texts describe this sensing as a quiet attunement, rather than a mystical vision. The priest simply stood still until he could feel where the heaviness tended to settle. Once he understood where the residue had gathered, he began his clearing. He carried a small fan woven from palm fibers, simple in appearance yet ritually significant. The fan represented breath and movement. The Egyptians believed that stagnant energy clung to places where air had become still, settling in quiet corners or along high beams. By stirring the air with the fan, the priest encouraged the stagnant residue to loosen and disperse. He moved the fan in slow, consistent motions, never allowing the air to be disturbed too harshly. If the movement was too abrupt, the residue might scatter and settle again in new places, instead of leaving the room entirely. After stirring the air, the priest transitioned to the second part of the clearing. He opened a small jar of powdered herbs, usually made from dried leaves of aromatic plants grown within temple gardens. These herbs were ground into fine dust, light enough to travel through air currents, but heavy enough to settle once the ritual was complete. The priest pinched a small amount of powder between his fingers and released it gently into the air. As the powder drifted, it functioned as a marker. Wherever it settled quickly, the priest recognized a place where stagnant energy was more concentrated. These areas required direct attention. When the powder fell unevenly, the priest approached the heavy spots and used the fan to blend the air around them. The Egyptians viewed this blending as a form of dispersion. Stagnant energy could not simply be pushed aside because it might gather again. Instead, it needed to be diluted until it merged with the neutral atmosphere of the room. The priest fanned the space until the air felt even. This feeling was subtle, but experienced priests recognized when the atmosphere had returned to balance. The final step involved the bowl of water placed at the edge of the offering hall. The water symbolized absorption, a force capable of drawing in the last traces of residue. The priest dipped his fingers into the bowl and flicked small droplets toward the areas he had just cleared. This action was not intended to cleanse the physical surfaces of the hall, but to anchor the air back into harmony. Egyptians believed that purified water not only cleansed, but also stabilized. The droplets fell lightly and quickly evaporated, leaving behind no mark except the sense that the room now held a quieter, calmer presence. From the offering hall, the priest moved into the statue workshops, storerooms, and narrow passageways. Each space required a slightly different approach. Large rooms needed broader movements, Narrow rooms required more precise fan sweeps. Rooms with high ceilings demanded the use of long-handled feather wands that helped circulate air near the upper corners. The ritual continued until every space that held ceremonial weight felt balanced enough to support the remaining duties of the day. When the clearing was complete, the priest stood quietly in the central hallway and listened. A well-cleared temple carried a particular quality of silence. It was neither empty nor hollow, but settled, like a surface undisturbed by wind. If the silence felt imbalanced, the priest returned to any rooms that needed further attention. Only when the silence held steady did he move on. With the temple atmosphere restored, the priest was ready for the next phase of his responsibilities. The Egyptians believed that once the space itself was balanced, the priest could safely engage in rituals that involved invoking, directing, or reshaping energy. Without proper clearing, such rituals risked blending with lingering residue, causing interference or confusion in the symbolic work that followed. The next task confronted a challenge different from residue, echoes, or thought. It involved the implements used in the rituals themselves. These objects absorbed energy from daily ceremonies, and their purity determined whether the temple remained stable. The priest would soon begin the careful work of cleansing and resetting each tool so that no remnants of yesterday's rituals affected the ones meant for today. Once the temple chambers had been cleared of lingering residue, the priest turned his attention to the tools that made the rituals possible. These objects, though physical and often simple in form, were believed to absorb traces of every ceremony they touched. A vessel that held sacred water carried the memory of yesterday's purification. A knife used in symbolic cutting held remnants of past confrontations with chaos. Even the fan woven from palm fibers collected subtle imprints of the air it stirred. The Egyptians understood that such remnants, if left unaddressed, could influence the effectiveness of the current day's rituals. The priest therefore carried the responsibility of returning each implement to a neutral, balanced state. The cleansing took place in a preparation chamber just outside the inner halls. The room was quiet and shaded, with soft light entering through a narrow slit high in the wall. This light was enough to illuminate the stone table where the implements were arranged. Each item had already been sorted according to its purpose. Objects used for purification were placed together. Objects used for offerings occupied another section. Objects connected to symbolic protection occupied a third. The Egyptians were meticulous about classification because each tool played a distinct role in maintaining order within the temple. The priest began with the vessels used for water. These vessels were typically made of alabaster, faience, or clay, and each material required a slightly different method of cleansing. He lifted the first vessel, holding it firmly, but with a deliberate gentleness. The Egyptians treated their implements with respect not because of superstition, but because they believed each tool served as an extension of divine order. He poured a small amount of fresh water into the vessel, swirled it slowly, and then poured it out into a shallow depression carved into the floor. This depression collected the used cleansing water until a temple servant later disposed of it in a place set aside for ritual waste. After the vessels came the blades. These were not metal weapons but ritual tools made from flint or copper, shaped for symbolic cutting rather than physical harm. The priest placed each blade flat on the stone table and sprinkled powdered natron over it. He then dipped his fingertips into a bowl of water and touched them lightly to the natron. The mixture formed a thin paste that he smoothed across the blade's surface. When the natron dissolved, it carried away the energetic remnants of the previous day's work. This process required careful attention because blades held strong symbolic influence. Even the slightest imbalance in their energy could disrupt rituals associated with separation, protection, or clearing. Next, the priest moved to the incense burners. These bronze or ceramic bowls retained traces of past smoke, not only as residue but as lingering energy from prayers and invocations. The priest wiped each burner with a clean linen cloth before placing a few grains of unlit incense inside. He then held the burner close enough to feel the warmth of his own breath. Temple texts describe this moment as a quiet exchange in which breath met grain, symbolically renewing the burner's ability to carry intentions upward. The priest then emptied the incense grains into the same carved depression in the floor, completing the cleansing. The fans and feather wands required a different approach. Because they moved air rather than holding physical substances, their cleansing focused on movement rather than contact. The priest lifted the fan and passed it slowly through a rising trail of incense smoke. The smoke curled around the fan, clinging briefly to the fibers before dispersing. This movement symbolized the release of old air and the renewal of the fan's ability to stir the unseen layers of space. Feather wands were treated the same way, with the priest guiding them gently through the smoke until the feathers glowed softly in the dim light. The offering plates and trays came next. These items carried the essence of food placed before the god, even after the physical food was removed. The priest wiped each surface with water that had been infused with lotus petals, a plant associated with rebirth and clarity. The water left a faint scent behind, reminding the priest that each tray was ready to receive new offerings without interference from the old. Throughout the process, the priest worked with a calm and steady rhythm. He did not rush, and he did not linger. The Egyptians believed that the state of the priest's mind affected the tools just as much as the cleansing itself. A tool purified by an unfocused priest was considered only partially cleansed. For this reason, the mental clarity ritual performed earlier was essential preparation for this stage of the day. Once all the implements were purified, the priest arranged them on the table in a specific order. Tools used early in the afternoon were placed closest to the entrance. Objects meant for later ceremonies were placed deeper within the room. This arrangement reflected the flow of the day, ensuring that each action in the temple moved seamlessly from one phase to the next. The Egyptians valued continuity in their rituals because continuity strengthened the connection between the earthly tasks of the priest and the cosmic responsibilities of the god. When the implements were ready, the priest paused and allowed the stillness of the room to settle around him. The work completed here prepared him for the next stage of the temple's daily cycle. The sanctuary had been sealed, the echoes cleared, the energy balanced, the mind quieted, and the tools renewed. The temple was now prepared for interactions with those who came seeking blessings, guidance, or healing. The next chapter begins at the threshold where the world outside touched the sacred interior, exploring how priests managed the steady flow of petitioners who approached the temple with hopes, fears, and requests that could shift the delicate balance the temple worked so hard to maintain. With the temple atmosphere balanced and the tools purified, the priest prepared for the part of the day when the outer world began to flow inward. Although the sanctuary remained sealed, the temple itself was not isolated from the needs of the community. People arrived seeking protection, healing, answers, or intervention from the gods. Their footsteps entered the courtyard. Their voices carried concerns that belonged to farms, families, illnesses, and daily survival. The Egyptians believed that these concerns carried weight, and that this weight could influence the temple unless received in a controlled and deliberate manner. It was the priest's responsibility to filter these human needs so that they aligned with the order of the sacred space rather than disrupt it. The reception took place in a hall designed with tall columns and wide passages that allowed sound to soften as it traveled. The architecture was intentional. Loud voices could not accumulate, and personal struggles could not cling to the space. People gathered in small groups, waiting their turn to speak with a priest. Some carried offerings such as bread, beer, flowers, or small clay figurines, shaped in the likeness of the problem they hoped to resolve. Others carried nothing but their worries. There were mothers with children, farmers troubled by failing crops, artisans seeking favor for their trade, and elders requesting protection for the final years of life. Their reasons varied, but each arrived believing the god within the sanctuary could influence their fate. The priest entered the hall with the quiet steadiness he had cultivated throughout the morning rituals. He moved slowly, so the atmosphere remained calm. When he approached the first petitioner, he listened without interruption. Listening itself was considered a sacred act because it allowed the priest to determine which concerns were personal burdens and which held symbolic meaning requiring ritual intervention. A simple complaint about poor harvest might reflect a deeper imbalance in the community. A dream troubling someone could be interpreted as a message requiring translation. The priest held the responsibility of deciding how to receive each concern without letting the weight of those emotions disturb the balance of the temple. When a petitioner offered an object, such as a loaf of bread or a bundle of herbs, the priest accepted it with both hands. This gesture prevented the offering from entering the temple in a disruptive manner. If the offering carried heavy emotional intention, the priest's calm handling helped neutralize it. He then placed the item on a small table where other offerings were collected. These offerings would later be sorted and used either for ceremonies or for distribution among the temple workers, depending on their nature and purpose. Some requests required only spoken guidance. The priest answered these quietly, using phrases drawn from traditional wisdom. Other requests demanded ritual action. A person seeking healing might receive a strip of linen blessed with water from the temple basin. Someone seeking protection might receive a charm inscribed with a symbol representing strength or renewal. These items were simple, but the faith behind them carried power for those who received them. The most delicate moments involved individuals whose concerns were tangled with fear or grief. Their emotions entered the hall with a weight that could be felt even without words. The Egyptians believed that intense emotion created disturbances similar to the residue that accumulated in ritual chambers. For this reason, the priest listened with patient presence and often invited the person to breathe slowly while speaking. Calming the petitioner helped maintain the stability of the space, allowing human pain to be acknowledged without overwhelming the sacred atmosphere. Throughout the process, the priest never promised results, because the outcome of each request was believed to rest with the god, not with human effort. His role was to prepare the path rather than determine its direction. He served as the channel through which concerns entered the sacred structure, ensuring they did so without disrupting the temple's order. When the morning audience concluded, the priest performed a brief acknowledgement ritual. He returned to the offering table, touched the items presented by the petitioners, and whispered a quiet phrase, affirming that these concerns had been received. This phrase did not seek resolution. Instead, it recognized the presence of human need within the sacred structure and prepared it for the god's symbolic awareness. Once the phrase was spoken, the weight of the petitioner's emotions no longer lingered in the hall. The atmosphere settled again, and the priest prepared for the next phase of the temple's daily cycle. As the hall emptied, sunlight shifted through the high openings in the walls. The sound of footsteps grew faint. The priest stood alone for a moment, allowing silence to return. The temple had absorbed the needs of the people, but the deeper rituals of the day still awaited completion. Beyond the reception hall lay a series of chambers where more complex tasks took place, many of them hidden from both petitioners and lower-ranked temple workers. The next chapter enters one of those concealed spaces, where the priest confronted the symbolic dangers that accompanied the god's role in maintaining order. These dangers were not visible, yet they were powerful enough to require rituals that blended concentration, symbolism, and controlled confrontation with forces believed to oppose the harmony of the world. After receiving the petitions of the people, the priest entered a part of the temple that only a few ever saw. These rooms did not face the courtyard, nor did they serve the daily life of the community. They existed for a single purpose: to confront and neutralize the symbolic forces the Egyptians believed threatened the god's strength each day. These forces were not imagined as physical beings moving through the temple, but as disturbances in the cosmic pattern, pockets of disorder that gathered wherever the balance between creation and chaos grew thin. The priest understood that his work here shaped not only the temple's stability, but the harmony of the entire world as the Egyptians perceived it. The chamber he entered was dim, with walls covered in images of protective deities, serpents bound in ropes, and symbols of dominance over disorder. The air felt thicker in this space, as though the weight of the room itself intensified the priest's focus. He stood in the center and allowed his breathing to settle before approaching the stone table on which several ritual objects rested. These were not the everyday tools used in offerings or purification. They were implements designed specifically for symbolic defense. The ritual began with the priest placing small clay figures on the table. These figures represented the forces of chaos in abstract form. Some resembled bound animals, others twisted shapes with exaggerated features. Their purpose was not artistic expression but representation. The Egyptians believed that naming and shaping the enemy in material form allowed the priest to address it more effectively. He arranged the figures in a pattern that mirrored descriptions found in temple texts, with the most dangerous figures placed closest to him. The arrangement itself was part of the ritual, designed to reflect confrontation rather than avoidance. Once the figures were arranged, the priest lit a small lamp. The light from the flame stretched across the table and cast elongated shadows on the walls. The Egyptians viewed these shadows not as distortions, but as extensions of the chaotic forces being addressed. By illuminating the figures, the priest symbolically drew the forces of disorder into view, giving them shape and boundary. Only when something had a boundary could it be controlled. He then opened a scroll that contained a series of protective utterances. Each utterance described a way of neutralizing the symbolic forces represented by the figures. Some passages spoke of binding, others described dissolving or weakening. The priest recited each line slowly, maintaining a steady voice that resonated softly within the closed space. The power of these utterances did not lie in their volume, but in their clarity. A mispronounced word or a wavering tone was believed to weaken the ritual's effect. Thus, the priest allowed each phrase to settle before moving to the next, creating a rhythm that filled the room with deliberate calm. After completing the recitations, the priest lifted a small flint blade. This blade had been purified earlier and now served as the instrument for symbolic severing. He did not use it aggressively. Instead, he moved it with slow precision, drawing gentle lines through the air or touching it lightly to the clay figures. These gestures represented the cutting of ties between the temple and the forces of chaos. The Egyptians believed that chaos attempted to anchor itself wherever ritual energy was concentrated, and that the act of cutting reminded the temple that disorder was not welcome. The priest then placed the blade down and picked up a small bowl of water infused with crushed lotus petals. The water represented renewal, and the lotus symbolized emergence from darkness. He dipped his fingers into the bowl and flicked droplets across the clay figures. As the droplets landed, they created small marks on the clay. These marks symbolized the weakening of the forces represented by the figures. The priest did not destroy the figures physically, because their purpose was to act as symbolic containers for the ritual. Instead, he allowed the droplets to dry naturally, indicating that their influence had been diminished. Next, the priest turned toward a wall that contained a carved depiction of the god in protective form. This image acted as a symbolic reinforcement, reminding the priest of the divine power he assisted. He touched the wall lightly with his fingertips, not as worship, but as acknowledgement. The Egyptians believed that such contact strengthened the connection between the priest's actions and the god's role in maintaining order. The touch also served to center the priest, grounding his focus after the mental intensity of the ritual. When the ritual reached its conclusion, the priest gathered the figures and placed them in a small container. These figures were not thrown away casually. They were taken to a designated place within the temple where they would remain undisturbed until they were needed for future rituals. Their continued presence reminded the temple staff that confronting chaos was an ongoing process, not a one-time victory. The room now felt lighter. The air carried a calm that had not been present when the priest first entered. He understood this shift, not as evidence of supernatural struggle, but as a sign that the ritual had restored the balance necessary for the temple to function properly. With the confrontation complete, he prepared to return to the main halls. The temple would soon move into the final stages of its daily cycle, which involved preparing the god for the symbolic journey into the afternoon and evening. The next chapter explores the transition from morning strength to afternoon endurance, a period when the god's power was believed to change in nature, requiring rituals that supported its shift from awakening to sustaining the order of the world. As the sun began its slow descent, the temple shifted into the final phase of its daily rhythm. The Egyptians believed that the transition from afternoon to evening carried significant spiritual weight. Morning symbolized emergence, afternoon represented endurance, and evening marked the beginning of withdrawal. This withdrawal was not a weakening of the god's presence, but a deliberate retreat into protection. Just as the sun prepared to enter the underworld, the god prepared for the symbolic journey into the realm of night, where unseen dangers moved more freely. The priest understood that his work during this time shaped the temple's ability to withstand the coming hours of darkness. The outer halls were quieter now. Most petitioners had returned home, and temple workers moved more slowly as the heat softened. Shadows stretched across the stone floor, creating long shapes that followed the contours of columns and walls. The priest walked through these shifting patterns with measured steps. The tranquility of the afternoon rituals remained in his posture, but the awareness of evening's approach added a layer of caution. The Egyptians believed that as daylight faded, the boundary between order and chaos thinned, requiring careful preparation. The first task involved inspecting the offering hall once more. The priest approached the symbolic offerings, arranged earlier grain, herbs, and dried fruits, and ensured they remained balanced. Afternoon stability had to extend into the evening. If any item had shifted during the day due to airflow or movement in the halls, the priest corrected it. The Egyptians treated these adjustments seriously, because evening imbalance indicated vulnerability. A table left uneven could symbolize a breach in the god's protection, and the rituals that followed depended on maintaining calm order. After confirming the stability of the offerings, the priest entered a chamber where soft incense burned at a lower intensity than in the afternoon rooms. This incense carried a scent associated with easing transitions. It did not invigorate or purify. Instead, it guided the mind gently towards stillness. The priest observed the movement of the smoke, noting its slow ascent and the way it curled near the ceiling. Evening incense acted as a reminder that the god's presence was preparing to soften, not disappear. The subtle drift of the smoke helped the priest attune himself to this gradual shift. The next room contained wall scenes that portrayed the sun's descent and the beginning of the night journey. These images depicted a solar boat gliding toward a horizon filled with deepening color. The priest stood before these scenes, allowing the imagery to settle into his awareness. The Egyptians believed that contemplating these depictions helped the priest align his actions with the cosmic cycle. In the same way the sun required guidance through the challenges of night, the god within the sanctuary needed support as its energy moved from outward strength toward inward protection. Once the priest had attuned himself to the imagery, he recited a sequence of evening utterances. These were quiet phrases focused on reassurance rather than confrontation. They affirmed the god's ability to remain steady during the hours when darkness expanded. Unlike the forceful recitations used in rituals addressing chaos, these utterances flowed gently. Their purpose was to soothe rather than to battle. The Egyptians believed that evening required softness because harshness risked disturbing the delicate balance of transition. When the utterances were complete, the priest approached a stone basin that held cooling water. This water symbolized evening calm, the stillness that followed the heat of the day. He dipped his hands into the basin slowly and raised them, letting the remaining droplets fall back into the water. The movement represented releasing the pressures of daylight. Any strain that might have settled into the temple during the afternoon was symbolically dissolved by this simple gesture. The Egyptians valued the quiet power of water at dusk because it signified renewal before nightfall. The priest then moved to a chamber used only during evening rituals. This room contained a small niche where a lamp burned steadily. The flame did not flicker as brightly as it had in the morning. It glowed with a lower, steadier light that reflected the god's shift toward inward focus. The priest approached the lamp, adjusted its wick, and ensured the flame burned evenly. An unsteady flame symbolized an unsteady transition, and this moment of care gave the room a calm center around which the rest of the evening rituals would gather. After tending to the lamp, the priest touched a carved symbol of protection near the chamber entrance. The carvings represented guardians who watched over the temple during the night. Touching the symbol acknowledged their role and reinforced the connection between the priest's actions and the energy they embodied. The Egyptians believed that night brought different kinds of dangers, and although the sanctuary remained sealed, the temple's protective boundaries required constant reinforcement. With the evening rituals near completion, the priest walked toward the sanctuary corridor. He did not enter the sanctuary itself, because the god had been sealed there since morning. Instead, he paused outside the heavy doors and closed his eyes. Although the doors remained shut, the priest sensed the subtle shift inside. The god's presence felt less expansive, more contained. The Egyptians believed that during the night, the god traveled symbolically through the unseen realms, confronting forces that could not be addressed during the day. The temple, therefore, needed to remain steady and balanced, so that the god's journey could unfold without disruption. The priest whispered a quiet acknowledgement, signaling that the temple was ready for night. The utterance did not call the god outward or ask for strength. It recognized the beginning of withdrawal, inviting the god to enter the protective stillness that came with the end of daylight. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the last of the light faded from the courtyard, the temple settled into its evening silence. The priest stepped back from the sanctuary doors, knowing that the world within had shifted once again. The rituals of the day had prepared the temple for the long hours ahead. The god, strengthened and safeguarded, could travel into the symbolic night with confidence. This marked the end of the daily cycle. All that remained was the stillness that waited until dawn, when the temple would open once more to renew creation, awaken the divine presence, and begin the cycle again.